There is a people that does not fit on the map, not the geographical one, but the historical one. The Japanese have always stood apart in the grand narrative of human origins in East Asia. An island nation, separated by the sea, language, rituals, and faces that are not quite like their neighbors. And for more than 1 century, scientists have tried to explain this fact using a simple, neat story. This story seemed convincing. It was logical. It had archaeological evidence. It had consistency. And that is exactly why it was accepted. But the story was too simple. For generations, the explanation seemed final, clean, convenient, almost too easy. And then a piece of evidence appeared, and the old version began to burst at the seams. To understand exactly what changed, one must return to the beginning, to the version that was taught in textbooks, repeated in museums, and accepted as the truth. The classical model of the origin of the Japanese people was called the two-wave theory.
It was simple and elegant.
According to it, the first inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago were the Jomon people. They arrived a very long time ago, back in the era of the last ice age, when the sea level was lower and land bridges connected the islands to the mainland. These people were hunters and gatherers. They sculpted unusual pottery with a cord-marked ornament, the oldest in the world. They lived in harmony with the forests, the sea, and the mountains. Their culture lasted for tens of thousands of years, almost without change. And then, approximately 3,000 years ago, a second wave came from the Korean peninsula. It was called the Yayoi. These were farmers who brought rice cultivation, metallurgy, new rituals, new tools, and a new language. They mixed with the Jomon, or displaced them, and it was from this mixing, as it was believed, that the modern Japanese people were born. It was a clean, convincing, almost biblical story. Two peoples, two waves, one result. And for a long time, this explanation worked. Until it did not. Because there was always one detail that did not fit. At first, it looked like an exception, a small anomaly, a trifle that could be explained by an error, a local phenomenon, or a coincidence. But the anomalies accumulated. And when there became too many of them, the old model began to fall apart. The first crack was the Ainu people. This is the indigenous population of the northern island of Hokkaido, which outwardly differed from the rest of the Japanese. They had thicker beards, different facial features, a different language, and different beliefs. They did not look like the Yayoi. They looked like someone much older. And some researchers suggested that the Ainu could be the direct descendants of the Jomon, who hardly mixed with the later arrivals. This in itself complicated the picture. If the Ainu were pure descendants of the Jomon, then how much of the Jomon remained in other Japanese people? And how complete was the displacement? The second crack appeared in the south. On the Ryukyu Islands, including Okinawa, the population also looked different. Studies showed that Okinawans are genetically closer to the Jomon than the inhabitants of the main island of Honshu. Again, the same mystery. Again, the same hint. The Jomon people did not disappear. They simply hid at the edges. And then came genetics. Modern methods of analyzing ancient DNA changed everything. Researchers began extracting genetic material from skeletons thousands of years old. Jomon bones, Yayoi bones, bones of Bronze Age people, bones of Iron Age people. Each sample told its own story. And when these stories were put together, a picture emerged that no one expected. The data did not simplify the past, they made it older. The first thing that was revealed was stunning. The Jomon genetic lineage was not just ancient, it was isolated, very isolated. So much so that it separated from other Asian lineages much earlier than previously assumed. Perhaps 30,000 years ago, perhaps more. This meant that the Jomon were not just another branch of the East Asian tree. They were a separate, very ancient, almost forgotten lineage of humanity. And this lineage was found almost nowhere else. Almost. Because DNA traces similar to the Jomon began to appear in very unexpected places. In ancient samples from Siberia, in certain populations of Southeast Asia, in groups that lived on the coasts, long disappeared or absorbed by other peoples. This suggested that the Jomon were part of a broader, very ancient coastal migration that stretched from Southeast Asia through Japan all the way to the northeast. A migration that existed long before the emergence of modern national borders, long before the advent of agriculture, long before written history even began to exist. And this is where the old story began to crack for real. Because if the Jomon were a fragment of this ancient coastal wave, then they were not just local hunters who accidentally ended up on the islands. They were witnesses to an era about which we know almost nothing. An era before agriculture. An era when people walked along ocean shores, through forests, through tundras, through places that now lie underwater. But this was only the first part of the discovery. The second part was even stranger. When scientists analyzed the genomes of modern Japanese people, they expected to see what the old theory described. Two components, Jomon and Yayoi, a simple mixture. Instead, they saw three. The third component did not fit into any of the known categories. It was neither Jomon nor classical Yayoi. It came later. It was associated with the population of Northeast Asia, possibly with regions near the Amur River or from territories that now belong to northern China and the Russian Far East. And it arrived approximately 2,000 years ago in an era that archaeologists called Kofun. This was the era of great burial mounds, the era of the emergence of the state, the era when huge keyhole-shaped tombs began to appear in Japan, surrounded by moats, filled with weapons, horse harnesses, and ceramic figures. The era when centralized power, hierarchy, and aristocracy first appeared on the islands. And so it turned out that this era was accompanied not only by a cultural, but also by a genetic transformation. A new wave of people arrived, a wave about which the old theory was silent, a wave that brought new genes, new technologies, and a new political structure. The old explanation was not useless, it was incomplete. And this is exactly where the story truly begins to branch out. Because the question no longer sounded like a simple one, where did the Japanese come from? The question became more complex. How many times did people arrive on these islands? Who were these people? What happened to those whom they displaced or absorbed? And why is the genetic trace of each of these waves so uneven across the entire country? Every answer spawned new questions. One of the explanations was that the third Kofun wave was associated with elites. That is, the newcomers did not just resettle on the islands, but established power there. They became the aristocracy, rulers, and warriors. And that is exactly why their genetic legacy is so deeply rooted in the modern Japanese population. Power leaves traces not only in history, but also in DNA. Another explanation suggested that the third wave came along with specific technologies: iron, horse breeding, new forms of military organization. And these technologies gave it a decisive advantage over the previous inhabitants. Yet another hypothesis stated that the migrations might not have been a single event, but a series of small waves over several centuries, each of which left its mark.
Each of which slightly changed the genetic landscape. None of these explanations was complete. Each was partially convincing, but each left unfilled gaps. What looked like an anomaly was actually a signal that the history of Japan was never the history of two peoples. It was the history of many peoples, of many arrivals, of many mixings, of many eras, each of which overlapped the previous one, not erasing it completely, but hiding it under new layers. And here arises one more mystery: the mystery of language. The Japanese language stands alone among the languages of the world. It has no obvious relatives.
Some linguists have tried to link it to Korean, but the evidence is weak. Others have proposed connections with the languages of the Altai, with the Tungusic languages, and with the Austronesian languages. But none of these theories has ever received final confirmation.
If the genetic history of the Japanese is so complex, so multi-layered, then perhaps the language is also a result of this complexity. Perhaps Japanese is not the descendant of one mother tongue, but the result of a long process of mixing, absorption, and transformation. Layer by layer, just like the genes themselves. Some researchers have suggested that the foundation of the Japanese language could have come along with the Yayoi from the Korean peninsula. Others believed that it arrived with the third wave from Northeast Asia. A third group argued that traces of a much older, possibly Jomon, linguistic foundation remain in it, which is now lost forever. Language, like DNA, did not provide a simple answer. It provided one more reminder of how deep this history is. And now imagine such a scene. The northern island of Hokkaido, early autumn. Fog rises above the forests. The air smells of wet bark, earth, and the sea. Somewhere deep in the forest stands a small Ainu village. An old man sits by the fire. His beard is thick, his eyes are dark. His hands are covered with tattoos passed down from generation to generation. He speaks a language that almost no one else understands, a language that does not belong to any known family, a language that is perhaps the last echo of the Jomon voice that sounded on these islands 30,000 years ago. He does not know about DNA research. He does not know about migration theories. But in his blood, in his bones, in his language, lives a time that science is only beginning to understand. And far to the south, on the island of Okinawa, a fisherman pulls a net from the warm sea. His face is also not quite like that of the residents of Tokyo or Kyoto. His ancestors also remember something else, something older, something that has been preserved thanks to isolation, thanks to distance, thanks to the fact that new waves did not reach this corner of the archipelago with the same force. Between these two people, between the north and the south, lies an entire country. A country that seems homogeneous. A country that tells a story about itself as a single people with a single history. But beneath this surface hides a web, not a straight line. A web of migrations, mixings, encounters, conflicts, and assimilations. What emerged was not a straight line, but a spider web. And this very spider web is the true history of Japan. Why then did the old theory hold on for so long? Why did the story of two waves seem so convincing for over 1 century? The answer, perhaps, lies not in science, but in human psychology. People want simple origin stories. We want to know where we came from, and we want this answer to be clean. One people, two waves, a clear result. It is satisfying. It creates a sense of belonging. It provides a myth upon which an identity can be built. Reality is almost always messier.
Reality consists of 1,000 small events, of migrations that lasted for centuries, of people who came and stayed, of people who came and disappeared, of marriages, wars, famines, and peaceful coexistences. Reality does not provide clean lines. It provides layers. And when science, especially genetics, begins to dig into these layers, it often destroys national myths. Not because scientists want to, but because data does not submit to desires. The data said that the Japanese descend not from two peoples, but from at least 3, perhaps from a larger number, perhaps from waves that have not even been identified yet, perhaps from people whose bones are still waiting in the earth, silent, but full of information. The data also said something even deeper. They said that no people on Earth is pure. No people originates from a single source. Every nation is the result of a long, tangled, often imperceptible process of mixing. Japan is no exception to this. On the contrary,
It is a vivid example of how complex this history can be. And yet, there remains a question that science cannot yet answer completely. Who were the Jomon really? If their genetic lineage is so ancient, so isolated, then where did they come from? Were they a fragment of some much older migration that swept the coastal zones of Asia tens of thousands of years ago? Were they connected to a population that has now completely disappeared? Did they preserve within themselves traces of an even older human path, perhaps from those times when modern humans were just leaving Africa and beginning their journey to the east? Some researchers have suggested a connection with the ancient population of Siberia, with people who lived along great rivers long before the last glacial maximum. Others pointed to possible connections with the population of the Tibetan Plateau, with mountain communities that preserved archaic genetic markers. A third group saw connections with the ancient inhabitants of the coast of Southeast Asia. None of these hypotheses was final. All of them were partial reflections of a great, lost history. Perhaps the Jomon were not just a people, but the last witness of an entire era. An era that preceded all great civilizations. An era when people lived differently, thought differently, and moved differently. An era of which almost nothing remains, except for cord-marked pottery, stone tools, and DNA traces in the blood of their distant descendants. If this is true, then Japan is not just an island in the east. It is an archive that has preserved what other regions have lost, an archive that is only now beginning to open. And every archive has its silence, its weight, its depth. Imagine a laboratory somewhere in Tokyo or Tsukuba, cold light, white tables, a small bone extracted from a cave that lay in the dark for thousands of years. A researcher carefully picks it up with tweezers. In this bone lies information that can change how an entire people understands itself. In this bone are fragments of a genome that existed long before the first Japanese word was written, long before the first temple was built, long before the first emperor ascended the throne. In the silence of the laboratory, time becomes material. It becomes a bone. It becomes a molecule. It becomes a signal. And when this signal is read, it does not give a simple message. It gives questions. Many questions. Questions about who we are, where we came from, and how much of our history we still do not know. Perhaps this is exactly where the true lesson of this discovery lies. Not in the fact that the old theory was wrong, not in the fact that the new theory is final, but in the fact that our ability to understand our own past is constantly changing. Every new generation of technologies reveals new layers. Every new generation of researchers asks new questions. And every new discovery does not close the book, but opens one more chapter of it. The history of Japan, like the history of any people, is not fixed. It is alive. It breathes. It changes along with our tools, with our methods, with our willingness to accept complexity instead of simplicity. And perhaps this is the most valuable of all that this scientific revolution has given. Not a new answer, but a new humility. The realization that we are not who we thought we were, not because the old story was completely untrue, but because it was too small. The Japanese did not emerge from two waves. They emerged from an ocean of time, in which these waves were only the visible surface. Beneath them lie currents, tides, and depths that are only beginning to be revealed. The old version was convenient. It provided a clean line. It provided a sense of completeness. But data does not like clean lines. Data likes the truth, even when it is inconvenient. And the truth, as it turned out, was this. The islands that we call Japan have been home to many peoples for tens of thousands of years. Some of them left a language, some left technologies, some left faces. Some left only DNA fragments that quietly live in the bodies of their distant descendants. unaware of their own antiquity. And when a modern Japanese person walks down a street in Tokyo, or sits on a Shinkansen train, or prays in an ancient temple in Kyoto, a web of ancestors lives within them, stretching across eras. Jomon hunters who walked through the forests 30,000 years ago, Yayoi farmers who brought rice 3,000 years ago, Kofun riders who arrived 2,000 years ago, and perhaps also those whom we have not yet named because we have not yet found their traces. A web instead of a line, layers instead of one layer, complexity instead of simplicity. The mystery was not solved, it was expanded. And perhaps this is exactly the true gift of science. Not final answers, but new dimensions of questions. Not the closing of a mystery, but its deepening. Not the end of the story, but its more honest beginning. The Japanese were not who we thought they were. Not because the old story was completely untrue, but because it was too small. And perhaps the same can be said about every people on Earth, about every nation that tells itself a story about its origin, about every identity built on simplification. Beneath every such story lies another, older, more complex one. A history of migrations that lasted for millennia, a history of encounters that remained nameless, a history of people who arrived, stayed, disappeared, mixed, and whose traces we are only now beginning to read. The wind blows over the archipelago as it blew thousands of years ago. The sea beats against the rocks as it beat when the first Jomon stepped onto these shores. The mountains stand silent as they stood when the Yayoi brought rice, when the Kofun riders brought iron, when all these waves of people arrived, one after another, forming what is now called Japan. The islands have not changed. The wind has not changed. The sea has not changed. Only our ability to see has changed. And when we look now, we see not one people, but many. Not one route, but a forest. Not one history, but an archive that still hides pages we have not read. The mystery has not ended. It has only just begun.